Welcome in APUSH Nation to your second Fireside Chat of the year. And on this Sunday, I'm going to be talking about the development of the Massachusetts colony. Now, to recap what we've sort of come to this point, we focused heavily on the plantation economy that developed in the Chesapeake region with Virginia and Maryland colonies. And then also I talked about the addition of colonies such as the Carolinas and Georgia, which also too feasted upon the plantation economy, and that drove with it the demand for labor, especially indentured servitude to begin with, and then later African labor. Now, while those are going on and those events are concurrently developing, we've got to go back in time a bit to 1620, and that's the seminal moment in the northeastern history of the British colonies, which is when the Mayflower arrived in Plymouth Harbor in 1620. I'm not going to go over too many details with you there because you guys have read the book. You gained an unbelievable amount of insight into the development of the colony. But I want to, again, tie this all back to what we've been talking about. So this is kind of like a compare and contrast. So when the Mayflower landed in 1620, Jamestown was still in its early days, and the Virginia colony had not yet exploded like it would with tobacco being its key cash crop. So really, in 1620, when William Bradford and the other members of the Separatist group and Puritans who arrived in Plymouth from Holland, by the time they arrived, Jamestown was already going. And in fact, if you remember from the book, it talked about how Virginia was where the Separatists were looking to go. But their ship went awry due to a storm, and they wound up in modern-day Massachusetts. Now, before the Pilgrims, as they were called, or Separatists, these groups of Separatists and Puritans from England and Holland, before they arrived and set ashore, Bradford and other male leaders of the group created one of the most seminal documents in American history, and that's the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact is crucial for you guys, even though we're not reading excerpts from the Mayflower Compact. I have seen numerous times the Mayflower Compact come up on tests, including the new format. And really what you want to take from the Mayflower Compact, it was the first written attempt to form a government union between the people settling in the British colonies. While the House of Burgesses was a legislative body that represented settlers in Virginia, the Mayflower Compact was a very primitive, if you will, form of a constitution. All males that were on board the Mayflower had to sign the compact. And essentially it was an agreement between the Separatists, those seeking religious freedom in the New World to practice their own version of Protestantism, and then those Puritans, the hardcore fanatical Puritans that also arrived in smaller numbers. And there was some conflict between those two religious groups. So the Mayflower Compact was, in a sense, an agreement that everyone could practice their religion freely in the new colony that was being formed in 1620, and also that laws would govern. And the Mayflower Compact would eventually foster the development of, again, a representative style government that would take place in Plymouth. Now, the development of Plymouth unquestionably suffered many of the same travails that Jamestown did. Starvation, lack of knowledge of the land and the terrain, conflict with Native Americans, although not to quite the extent of Jamestown. So you can certainly compare the two origins, the two colonies' origins, Plymouth and Jamestown, in a similar respect because of the fact that the early years wrought a great deal of death. But again, a separate point to bring up about the Pilgrims that landed at Plymouth is they had this document, the Mayflower Compact. And that document would actually last all the way until eventually Massachusetts was incorporated into a larger colony. But please understand that this goes back to what I said the colonial period is all about, and its precedents. Now, as the colony began to develop, what you're going to realize, one of the key differences between the Plymouth colony and what was going on down in Jamestown, Virginia, and Maryland, which started shortly after Plymouth, the style of farming was greatly different. And that is more a product of the landscape, the environment, the terrain, the soil and the location of the colonies, Mother Nature sort of dictates this major difference. And while in the Chesapeake region, tobacco became the cash crop, along with corn as well, and indigo, because of the hot, humid climate. In the Massachusetts region, where Plymouth started, you didn't have nearly the same climate. So as Plymouth began to thrive and more settlers arrived in Plymouth, small farming was more of the way of life. And these small farms, here's the buzz term to make sure you guys get this down, these small farms are called freeholds. Freeholds. And these freehold farms were really a crucial part of the development of the Plymouth colony. And beyond Plymouth, eventually, freehold farming would become a greater piece of Massachusetts development and also the region that would eventually become known as New England. Freehold farming is essentially small, independently owned farms, whereas in comparison to the large-scale plantation farming, freeholds were much smaller. They were privately owned, usually by one family, and they didn't require nearly the amount of labor that a plantation would. And therein lies a key to understanding some of the most significant differences between the Plymouth colony and the surrounding Massachusetts region compared to their neighbors down south in the Chesapeake and the other southern colonies. Because the farming style was smaller and the freeholds did not take and require as much labor, indentured servitude and eventually African slave labor was on a much smaller scale than it was down in Chesapeake and the other southern colonies. Now make no mistake, indentured servitude and African labor did exist in the New England colonies, including Plymouth and including parts of Massachusetts and other colonies that would come later. That's key, because sometimes we like to think of the distinction between slavery as North and South being cut off rigidly, but it's not true. In the beginning, Plymouth had indentured servants. It was a way to get people to come to the colony, and it was also it also incorporated African labor. But because the freehold system was much smaller, privately owned, you didn't have that demand for mass labor. Now, another term that comes up a lot with the freehold system was this idea of yeoman work. Now, you may have heard that term before as an adjective to describe blue-collar, dedicated, determined, disciplined style of work. But yeoman work, Y-E-O-M-A-N, was a characteristic that became embedded in the lifestyle of Plymouth and other parts of Massachusetts. And the idea of yeoman work is that a person really had to earn their living on these freehold farms. Life didn't just come to you, and farming didn't just happen. You had to really go out and make your sustenance happen. And this is where the religious aspect of the Plymouth colony truly was an integral part as well. The separatists that broke away from the Church of England were fervently Protestant. They were devout to their religion. And of course, those Puritans who also came with the first ships, but would come in later large numbers during the English Civil War due to all the turmoil that was going on in England. Both groups, separatists and Puritans, believed in religion, and to the extent that their religious beliefs played such a pivotal role in their outlooks on everything in life, including farming. So that term yeoman work, if you ever see yeoman farming or yeoman work, please relate that back to the freehold system that developed in New England. And again, this is a significant difference with the Chesapeake colonies in that you had much smaller, privately owned farms compared to large plantations. Remember, too, Plymouth was not a proprietary colony. It was formed under religious reasons to practice religion freely. So while the Plymouth colony was formed on the auspices of a joint stock company, much of Massachusetts would later develop as proprietary, including the Massachusetts Bay Colony that was formed in the mid to late 1620s and really grew in the 1630s. And to talk more about Massachusetts Bay, I'm going to bring in Parthy Hardy, who is my teaching assistant this year. Parthy was a stalwart member of APUSHnation last year. Not to embarrass her, she earned a 5, so she clearly knows what she's doing when it comes to the curriculum. So Parthy is going to be a resource for you guys all year long, and even on the Fireside chats. So Parthy, I'm going to let you talk about the Puritans, the development of Massachusetts Bay a little bit and some of the ideology that was embedded there, which, of course, you guys can then think back to the Mayflower book and think about how that was different. So, Parthvi, welcome in.
Hey, Push Nation. So I'm guessing for the past week or so, Mr. Smith has been talking about all of the movements and the escapes from England and its political unrest and religious unrest, and the movements from that to the new land. A big reason I'm sure Mr. Smith has mentioned, the reason for fleeing England is because of the religious problems and all the different Charleses happening and things like that. So another religious group of people that couldn't handle the political and religious unrest were the Puritans. They migrated with their leader, John Winthrop. They migrated from England to a new and fresh colony named Massachusetts Bay Colony. This colony obviously was located in Massachusetts. It was a proprietary colony, so its sole purpose wasn't to make money and generate revenue for the government, but it was rather to practice religion away from the whole corruption happening back home. A big reason as to why the Puritans left is because they wanted to further strengthen and cleanse their religion. That's how I remembered it last year, and I found it really helpful that if you just put two words together, it seems to stick with you more. So Puritans equals strengthen and cleanse, and that's why they left England. Another defining characteristic of the Puritans is predestination. This leads back to John Winthrop. John Winthrop was the leader of the Puritans, and he's the one who led this mass migration from England to the new land. This mass migration of solely Puritans later in history was termed the Great Migration because it just embodied the amount of Puritans that truly left England to come to the new colonies. So again, predestination, John Winthrop. John Winthrop's speech, City Upon a Hill, sort of reflects this idea of predestination. Puritans believed that God had chosen and predestined this group of elect people, and these elect could only be Puritans, and thus they were representatives of what God could do, and they knew best for the people and for the Puritans. The City Upon a Hill, the main line in that I remember to this day sorry, I know this, guys. The City Upon a Hill, we are a city upon a hill and all eyes are upon us. Meaning that John Winthrop put all of the Puritans on a pedestal. In this pedestal, they were doing everything on God's behalf. Which means his whole idea for his speech was to bring out the passion in the Puritans, saying that we are starting something new. And because of that, we must be strong, we must be unified, and we must always, always, always embody the ideals of what God wanted from us. That whatever we do reflects back on him. And if we mess up badly, he's going to forsake us in the times of need. And thus, we must do everything we can to please him and serve him. The Puritans, were a strong, fermented religion, and John Winthrop did a great deal with that. And City Upon a Hill is a stark remembrance of exactly who the Puritans were and what they did and what they stood for. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you, Parthvi. Very excited to have you on board this year as part of our APUSH Nation Fireside Chats, and we'll be seeing a lot more of you, I'm sure. I can't overstate enough the importance of some of the issues that Parthvi raised, because where I've seen students in the past struggle is they have a hard time differentiating between Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. So again, just to reiterate, Plymouth is where the original settlers, the separatists, and some Puritans went to break away and practice their religion freely. That's the whole genesis of the Mayflower narrative that you read in the Philbrick book. Massachusetts Bay Colony was set up later as a proprietary colony for Puritans. That's really what is so crucial to realize. So as Plymouth grows and as Mass Bay grows, Mass Bay and Plymouth are two separate colonies. Eventually, they're going to form the colony of Massachusetts. But for the initial 50 or 60 years of the colonies, they were developing on separate paths. And this would, of course, come back to you with the idea of King Philip's War, and eventually Plymouth and Mass Bay would have to sort of band together in defense of their territory and in conquest of the Native Americans they came into conflict with. So again, Parthi did a really nice job. And that idea that she raised about the city upon a hill, we're going to touch upon that very soon when we start looking at the ideology that develops, not just in Massachusetts, but in other parts of the colonies as well, this sort of us versus them idea with the Native Americans. But again, today's focus was really just to reinforce the idea about how differently the labor systems were in Massachusetts. And this would also be in other colonies as well. Plymouth was the first, Mass Bay came second, then you've got New Hampshire, and then you've also got Vermont, which were also formed as proprietary colonies. So again, in this whole region of New England, which is also going to include Rhode Island and Connecticut, by the way, and I'm going to talk to those how they got started Wednesday when we look at religion in the colonies. But anywhere you look in New England, so Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, all those states today that are in the New England region, when they were formed as colonies, they had indentured servitude, they had African labor, but much, much, much smaller scale than the Chesapeake and the southern colonies as well. The freehold system dominated this way of life. The yeoman work, that idea, that concept that I brought up earlier in the chat, that's going to be embedded in all those regions. And again, we're going to now focus on these colonies on Wednesday when we wrap up the Mayflower debates, which I am so pumped about. Don't forget that tomorrow, 5th and 7th hour, you guys are on your own, and I'll be with first hour helping out a little bit before the field trip. But when we get to the debates on Tuesday, we're really going to focus in on religion and how religion was such a central idea in the development of the New England colonies, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, all of them. And then we're going to kind of pivot and talk further about in the last region, we have the Mid-Atlantic to cover. And then, by the assessment on Friday, you guys will be in good shape to have a good understanding of most of the components of the colonial era, just minus, kind of the culture and lifestyle and how Native Americans fit into all that. So I'm really excited where we're going with this the rest of this week. And again, take notes, hopefully, on all this stuff. And my office hours, as you saw, are now this week, Wednesday. So anything that's not jiving and you want to come in before the assessment on Friday, Wednesday, I'll have 2 hours of office hours from 3:45 to 5:45. So in the meantime, get through the rest of your Sunday and come in ready to go tomorrow on debate prep. And then we got those debates on Tuesday. Can't wait. Thanks, APUSH Nation. And remember, the past shapes the future.